You may have spent years asking for a life that requires faith, while quietly expecting defeat as your most reliable outcome. Not because you are weak, not because you do not believe in something greater, but because somewhere beneath the prayer, beneath the desire, beneath the vision of a better life, there lives a very old and very practiced expectation that this will not work for you, that the door will close again, that the money will not come, that the opportunity will pass, that the story will end the same way it always has. James Allen, one of the most precise minds in the history of inner teaching, understood something that most people never fully confront. He understood that expectation is not a casual feeling. It is not a passing thought or a mood that drifts through the mind and disappears without consequence. Expectation is trained thought aimed at the future. It is the inner posture that determines what the mind will recognize, what the will is prepared to pursue, and what kind of life the character has quietly agreed to receive. If that expectation is aimed at defeat, no amount of desire, prayer, or spiritual sincerity can fully override what the inner self is genuinely prepared for. You may know this feeling better than you want to admit. You apply for something, and before the answer arrives, you have already pictured the rejection. You begin a new effort, and before the first result appears, you have already rehearsed the explanation you will give to others when it fails. You speak about your financial situation, and inside the words, woven between the sentences, there is a quiet agreement that this is probably how it will remain. Not from laziness, not from lack of effort, but from something that has become deeply familiar, the expectation that defeat is simply more likely than anything else. This shows up in the small moments, not just the large ones. Someone does not return a call, and immediately the mind translates the silence as rejection. A project moves more slowly than expected, and immediately the mind translates the delay as proof that it will never arrive. An opportunity appears through an unfamiliar door, and immediately the mind translates the unfamiliarity as a sign that it cannot be trusted. The expectation of defeat is not only present in the dramatic collapses, it is active in the thousand small interpretations that happen throughout the ordinary day. It shows up in how you enter a room when you need something from someone whose answer matters. There is a rehearsed apology already living in the posture, already present in the voice before the first word is spoken. The body communicates a conclusion the mind has already reached. The conclusion is not spoken, but it is transmitted, and the person on the other side of the conversation often responds to what they feel beneath the words rather than to the words themselves. Defeat expectation is not private. It leaks into presentation, into persistence, into the quality of the attempt. It shows up in the way financial conversations happen inside the mind before they ever become real conversations. The mind calculates the obstacles before it calculates the possibilities. It rehearses the worst outcome with more detail and more emotional investment than it gives to the best outcome. Not because the worst outcome is more likely by any objective measure, but because defeat has been practiced so long it feels like intelligence. The mind calls it realism. The mind calls it preparation. The mind calls it being smart enough not to be hurt again. It shows up in relationship to opportunity itself. The kind of opportunity that could change a life is rarely obvious. It rarely arrives in the exact shape the mind expects. It rarely comes through the channel the mind has already approved. But the mind that expects defeat will not wait to understand an unusual opportunity. It will disqualify it immediately. It will find the flaw, name the risk, identify the reason it cannot work, and return to the familiar posture of waiting for something that, when it arrives, will also be found insufficient. The defeat-expecting mind does not need evidence of failure. It generates the conclusion ahead of the evidence. It shows up in the way courage erodes before the attempt is complete. You begin something. You bring genuine effort to the beginning. But when the first difficulty appears, something inside shifts. Not from the difficulty itself, but from the way the difficulty confirms what was already expected. The first obstacle is not just an obstacle, it is experienced as the announcement that this too will fail. And the effort that follows that announcement is not the same as the effort that preceded it. The body continues moving, but the soul has already accepted the outcome. Partial effort wearing the mask of full effort is one of the most common and least examined forms of defeat expectation. It shows up in the language used to describe the future. Listen to the way someone who expects defeat talks about what is coming. They do not say it is impossible. They have learned to soften it. They say things like, "I will try, we will see. I hope so, but you never know. Things like this never really work out for me. Maybe this time will be different, though I doubt it." These sentences do not sound like obvious defeat. They sound like caution. They sound like lived experience. They sound like the reasonable modesty of someone who has been disappointed before. But beneath that careful, reasonable-sounding language, a signal is being sent. And the signal says, "I am not ready to be surprised by good." This is not a character flaw, this is a pattern that was built. It was built in rooms where effort was not rewarded. It was built in seasons where faith seemed to produce nothing. It was built by watching plans collapse and relationships end, and finances fail in ways that could not be explained by effort alone. The expectation of defeat did not arrive without reason. It arrived because experience seemed to confirm it repeatedly. And over time, it stopped feeling like a learned response and started feeling like the truth. That is the point at which it becomes dangerous, not when it is a wound, but when it has been mistaken for wisdom. Here is the contradiction that sits at the center of this teaching. You want a life that requires faith. You want the kind of provision that comes through unexpected channels. You want the door to open in a way you did not plan. You want the financial turn to arrive in a way you could not have engineered. You want the source to move through means you could not have predicted. These desires are genuine. The prayer behind them is real. The longing is sincere. But a life that requires faith demands a mind that is prepared to receive through faith. And a mind that has been trained to expect defeat is not that mind. Not yet. The desire says, more. The expectation says, not for me. The prayer says, let it come. The inner posture says, it probably will not. The vision says a different life is possible. The practiced thought says, things like this do not happen to people like me. These are not opposites living in separate compartments of the self. They are in active and continuous conflict, and the conflict itself becomes one of the most exhausting and least named experiences in a sincere person's inner life. You are not lazy. You are not faithless. You are fighting two things at once, and one of them has been practicing longer than the other. The deeper truth is that most people who expect defeat do not expect it consciously. They would not choose it if they could simply choose otherwise. They would not hold the image of failure in the mind willingly if willingness were all it took to release it. The expectation of defeat is not always a belief that has been carefully considered and accepted. It is often more like a reflex, an automatic reinterpretation of incoming events that happens too fast to be intercepted by conscious intention. By the time the mind is aware that it has already concluded failure, the conclusion has already begun shaping the response. This is precisely why telling someone to simply expect better rarely works. The expectation of defeat is not a surface-level thought. It is a pattern embedded in the character. James Allen's entire body of teaching points toward this truth. He did not teach that changing a single thought changes a life. He taught that thought held repeatedly and emotionally becomes character, and character becomes the lens through which the entire world is seen, approached, and received. The expectation of defeat has not merely become a thought. For many people, it has become a feature of the self. And the self does not release features easily. This creates a painful situation for someone who is genuinely spiritually seeking. Because the sincerity of the seeking is real, the desire for more is real, the prayers are real, but the internal architecture that was built by years of defeat expectation does not step aside because the desire is sincere. It remains in place. It continues interpreting. It continues filtering. It continues preparing the character for the outcome it has been trained to receive. And the result is that the life the viewer is asking for requires a version of them that defeat expectation is actively preventing from forming. The life that arrives through unexpected provision requires a character that can hold open the receiving. The life that comes through a door the mind did not design requires a character that does not immediately disqualify unexpected doors. The financial turn that arrives through an unusual channel requires a character that does not interpret the unusual as a sign of fraudulence. The inner shift required is not a shift in desire. The desire is already present. The shift required is in the deep trained expectation that has been quietly building the character you bring to every moment the provision attempts to arrive. There is also the matter of identity. The defeat-expecting self has a very clear sense of what kind of person it is. It is the kind of person to whom certain things do not happen. Prosperity in unexpected forms does not happen. A financial life that requires radical trust does not happen. A turning point that defies every visible calculation does not happen. These are things that happen to other people, people with different backgrounds, people with different connections, people who are positioned differently from the beginning. The defeat-expecting mind has quietly assigned itself to a category, and it defends that category with a logic that feels undeniable because it is built entirely from past evidence. But James Allen did not teach that the past is irrelevant. He taught something more precise and more important. He taught that the mind is not condemned to remain what it has practiced. He taught that thought held with sustained emotional intensity eventually becomes character, and character eventually becomes destiny. This means the direction of the teaching is not backward. It does not ask you to explain your defeat. It asks you to ask something harder. It asks you to examine what you are currently training. What future are you preparing the character to receive? Because the character being trained right now through the repeated emotional thought of today is the character that will be standing before the next opportunity when it arrives. James Allen did not write for people who were comfortable. He wrote for people who were tired of the distance between what they desired and what they were living. He wrote for people who had a sincere inner life and yet could not understand why the outer life refused to follow. His most enduring teaching, the one that runs beneath everything else he wrote, is that the outer world is not the origin of the problem. The outer world is the report. The inner world is the cause. The thought you hold most consistently is the seed that, over time, becomes the character that over time becomes the life you inhabit. This is not a casual observation. Allen approached it with the precision of a man who had examined his own inner life through great personal difficulty and had found a law operating there that did not flatter him. He did not teach that positive thinking produces instant results. He did not teach that desire alone rearranges circumstances. He taught something more serious and more demanding than either of those things. He taught that the thought you allow to occupy the mind repeatedly and emotionally is not merely a mental event. It is a formative event. It is building something, and what it is building is the character through which every future event will be experienced. Expectation, understood through Allen's teaching, is not a passive emotional state. It is not the feeling you have while waiting for something. It is the thought you return to again and again about what the future holds for you. It is the inner declaration of what you believe is coming. And because thought, held long enough and felt deeply enough, becomes character, expectation is one of the most active forces in the shaping of a human life. What you expect trains the self. What the self has been trained by becomes the instrument through which the life is lived. This is why Allen wrote about thought not as something that merely reflects what is happening, but as something that is actively causing what is becoming. He saw the mind as a garden. That image is not decoration, it is precision. A garden does not produce crops that were never planted. A garden does not suppress the growth of what was planted simply because the gardener did not intend to plant it. What is sown is what grows. And in the garden of the mind, expectation is not a neutral passenger. It is one of the most powerful and consistently active forms of sowing. Now consider what happens when the sowing is defeat. When the expectation that is returned to daily, that is felt deeply in the body during times of uncertainty, that is rehearsed whenever a new attempt is made, is the expectation of a bad outcome. When the thought that visits most consistently is the thought that this will not work, that the money will not come, that the opportunity will pass, that the effort will be wasted, that things always collapse in the end. This is not neutral mental weather. This is active planting. And what is planted consistently will grow, not as a punishment but as a law. Allen's teaching asks the reader to take full responsibility for the inner garden without self-condemnation. The point of identifying a defeat-expecting pattern is not guilt. It is clarity. Because if the thought that is being sown is visible, then the harvest that is approaching can be understood. And if the sowing can be changed, the harvest will change. Not instantly, not magically, not without difficulty, but inevitably, because the law does not operate selectively. It operates on what is planted. Change what is planted with enough sustained intention, and the character will gradually begin to take a new shape. What makes Alan's teaching so demanding is that it does not allow for the separation of thought and outcome that most people prefer. Most people want to believe that the outer world can be changed by outer action alone. That if enough effort is applied to the visible circumstances, the circumstances will eventually yield. Alan does not deny effort. In fact, he insists on it, but he places effort in its proper position. Effort without a changed inner garden produces a changed outer appearance that returns to the original inner condition. The outer life cannot remain substantially different from the inner life for long. This is not pessimism. This is law. He also taught something that is frequently overlooked in popular treatments of his work. He taught that the quality of the thought matters as much as the content. It is not enough to say a positive thing while feeling a defeated thing. The formative power is not in the word. It is in the sustained, emotionally real inner posture. A person can declare abundance in the morning and spend the rest of the day rehearsing collapse with far more emotional energy and far more mental detail. In that case, the declaration is a small seed dropped on hard ground, while the defeat rehearsal is a sustained, deeply felt, emotionally watered planting. The harvest will not favor the declaration simply because the declaration was made. This is why discipline is central to Alan's vision. Not the discipline of forcing the mind to think only pleasant thoughts, not the suppression of difficulty or the denial of pain, but the discipline of choosing which seeds receive sustained emotional water, the discipline of noticing when the rehearsal of defeat has become the dominant occupation of the inner garden, and returning, not once but consistently, to a different way of holding the future. This is what Alan means by guarding the mind, not from all thought, but from the continued cultivation of thoughts that build a character incapable of receiving the life the soul sincerely desires. Character is the word Alan returns to most consistently, and that word must be held with precision. Character is not personality. Character is not the presentation you offer the world. Character is the deep inner shape of the self. It is the set of repeated responses, automatic interpretations, and practiced postures that define what the self is capable of in any given moment. And character is not inherited. It is not fixed. It is the accumulated result of the thoughts that have been sown and watered over time. This means that character is changeable, but it changes the way a garden changes, not overnight, not by declaration alone, but through sustained, serious, disciplined attention to what is being planted. The person who expects defeat has built that expectation into the character. It is not a thought floating on the surface of awareness. It is a deep groove in the inner architecture of the self. It responds automatically. It interprets without waiting to be asked. It has become part of who the person experiences themselves to be. And this is precisely why the path forward is not about forcing a different feeling. It is about the patient, sustained intentional work of planting something different long enough that the character begins to hold its new shape, long enough that the automatic response begins to shift, long enough that the new expectation stops feeling foreign and begins feeling like the truer self. This is the law Alan taught, not a law of instant manifestation, not a law that rewards sincerity with immediate delivery, a law of formation. A law that says the thought you tend with sustained emotional investment becomes the self, and the self becomes the life. Defeat expectation is not just a feeling, it is a formation event that has been happening for a long time, and the teaching of James Allen does not ask you to regret the formation. It asks you to become serious about what you are forming right now, today, in this season of your life, with the thoughts you are choosing to water. There is something in Alan's teaching that most people walk past because it does not feel like an instruction. It feels like an observation, but it is the hinge on which everything else turns. He observed that a person does not attract what they want, a person attracts what they are. Not what they declare, not what they desire, not what they pray for in the early hours of the morning when the sincerity is real and the longing is deep. A person attracts what the character has been formed to receive, and defeat expectation, held long enough, has formed a character that receives defeat. This is a different kind of teaching than most prosperity frameworks offer. Most prosperity frameworks begin with desire. They say, name what you want, feel it clearly, and trust the invisible law to deliver. That is not false, but it is incomplete without this deeper truth. The character that stands in the receiving position must be capable of holding what arrives. A character built by years of defeat expectation does not stand in the receiving position. It stands in the bracing position, braced for impact, braced for disappointment, braced for the familiar outcome that confirms the familiar story, and something braced cannot receive. Reception requires openness. Bracing is the opposite of openness. Think about what defeat expectation actually trains the character to do. It trains the mind to look for early signs of failure in any new situation. It trains the attention to move toward obstacles before moving toward possibilities. It trains the will to engage with limited commitment, because full commitment to something you expect to fail is a particularly painful form of loss. It trains the voice to use hedged language that keeps disappointment at a comfortable distance. It trains the body to present itself with the posture of someone who is not entirely convinced. All of these things are trained. All of them are the result of thought that has become character. And all of them act together to produce a very particular kind of life. The forgotten meaning of Allen's law is that the expectation of defeat is not merely a prediction, it is a preparation. When you expect defeat, you're not simply anticipating a bad outcome. You're actively preparing the self to recognize defeat when it arrives, to accept defeat as the confirmation of the established pattern, and to act from defeat as the operating assumption going forward. The mind does not need to wait for defeat to happen. It has been preparing for it so thoroughly that by the time it arrives, it does not feel like a catastrophe. It feels like the familiar shape of reality. It feels like the world confirming what you already knew. Allen understood that this is how destiny forms, not through dramatic choices made at dramatic moments, but through the quiet, consistent, daily training of what the self expects, accepts, and acts from. He called this cause and effect as iron law. There is no softness in that phrase. He did not say cause and effect as a general tendency or cause and effect as a rough pattern. He called it iron law. What the character is trained to expect, recognize and act from will over time, produce the life that confirms that expectation, not because the universe is cruel, but because the law does not have opinions about what you deserve. It only recognizes what has been formed. This is also why defeat expectation is so persistent. It is not just a thought, it is a confirmation engine. Every time a delay occurs, the defeat-expecting character registers it as evidence. Every time a plan fails, the defeat-expecting character does not simply note the failure and adjust. It notes the failure as the latest entry in a long and consistent record that was always pointing in this direction. The character that has been formed by defeat expectation does not experience setbacks as neutral events requiring neutral interpretation. It experiences them as the fulfillment of its deepest and most trusted expectation. And that fulfillment deepens the formation. The question that emerges from this teaching is not, why does this person keep experiencing defeat? That question, while natural, leads the mind backward into the history of pain and away from the only place where change is possible. The question Allen's teaching raises is, what is the character currently being trained to receive? Because the answer to that question is the answer to the future, not the desired future, not the prayed-for future, but the actual future that the character, as it is currently formed, will be capable of receiving. There is also the matter of how defeat expectation trains the character in relation to action. Allen was not a teacher of passivity. He consistently emphasized that the inner law must be expressed through disciplined, sustained, patient outer action, but defeat expectation does something devastating to action. It removes from action the very quality that makes it formative. It removes conviction. Action taken with the genuine expectation of a good outcome is not the same as action taken from defeat expectation. The first is a form of planting. The second is a form of going through the motions while braced for the inevitable. The outer behavior may look similar. The inner formation being created by each is entirely different. This is why the solution is not to act harder while expecting defeat. Acting harder while expecting defeat simply produces exhausted, bitter, and increasingly confirmed defeat expectation. The character being formed by that combination is not the character capable of receiving the life that is being desired. The solution, in Allen's framework, is to change what is being planted before the action intensifies, because action is most powerful when it is the natural outer expression of a changed inner character. When the expectation has shifted from defeat to something more aligned with faith, the quality of the action changes from performance under dread to movement from genuine inner conviction. Allen's teaching does not pretend this is easy. He was not writing comfortable philosophy for comfortable lives. He was writing from the experience of a man who had faced significant personal hardship and had found that the inner law operated even when the outer circumstances were painful and confusing. He found that the law did not exempt him from difficulty. He found that it operated precisely within difficulty, and what he found was this: that the character formed by sustained, serious, disciplined inner attention to what was being planted eventually produced a life that corresponded to that planting. Not instantly, but inevitably. Because iron law does not make exceptions. The forgotten meaning, the one that transforms the teaching from a pleasant observation into a serious working law, is this: every day of defeat expectation is a day of formation. Every thought that returns to the assumption of failure, every rehearsal of collapse, every moment the mind settles comfortably into the familiar posture of bracing for the worst, is a day the character is being trained in a direction. And the character being trained today is the one that will stand before tomorrow's opportunity. The question is not whether formation is happening. Formation is always happening. The question is what the formation is producing, and whether that is what you are willing to keep choosing. The error is not that you have experienced defeat. Everyone who has lived long enough and tried sincerely enough has experienced defeat. The error is not even that the defeat left a mark. Marks are the honest record of a life that took real risks and encountered real resistance. The error is something more specific than that, and it is more invisible than most people realize. The error is that you began expecting defeat, not because you wanted to be defeated, but because expecting defeat felt like the only way to remain safe from the full devastation of being completely surprised by loss. You chose to be perpetually slightly disappointed, rather than risk being entirely undone by hope. This is not a foolish choice on the surface. In fact, it is a very intelligently constructed emotional defense. If you always expect the worst, you are never caught off guard. If you hold the image of failure close before the attempt, you have already partially absorbed the shock before it arrives. If you keep your hopes small and your confidence visible only on the outside, the interior remains protected. You cannot fall far from a position you have already privately resigned from. This is the architecture of the error. It is not stupidity. It is a strategy that was designed to protect the self from pain, but a strategy that, over time, became the primary obstacle to the life the self was asking for. James Allen would recognize this error immediately. He described the mechanism in different language, but the underlying pattern is exactly what his teaching addresses. A person who has been hurt by hope begins to treat hope itself as the danger, rather than treating the absence of vision as the danger. The mind that has been wounded by expectation learns to wound its own expectations before anything external can do it, and what this produces is a self that is perpetually pre-defeating itself, not from lack of courage in the dramatic sense, but from a very consistent, very quiet, very practiced form of inner surrender that happens before the outer battle is even joined. The error shows up in a particular form that is easy to miss because it wears the clothing of experience. The person who expects defeat rarely says, "I am afraid to hope." They say, "I am being realistic." They say, "I have seen how these things go." They say, "I know my track record." They say, "I am just managing my expectations." And every one of these sentences is true. They are not fabricated, they are drawn from real experience. They are the accurate summary of a real history, but accuracy about the past is being used as an argument against the future, and that is where the error lives, not in the honesty about what has happened, but in the conclusion that what has happened is the permanent law of what will happen. Here is what the error produces in practice. It produces a person who is always available for the evidence of defeat and never fully available for the evidence of increase. The two experiences do not receive equal attention. When something goes wrong, the defeat-expecting mind captures it, catalogues it, names it as confirmation, and uses it to deepen the already established expectation. When something goes right, the defeat-expecting mind receives it cautiously, delays full acknowledgement, explains it as an anomaly, or frames it as temporarily good fortune that should not be relied upon. The inner ledger is not kept fairly. The entries that confirm defeat are weighted heavily. The entries that should challenge defeat are discounted. This asymmetry is the error at work in real time, and it means that even when the evidence of possibility is genuinely present, the character formed by defeat expectation will not process it as such. The open door will not register as an open door. It will register as an unusually shaped obstacle or as a door that must eventually close. The unexpected financial shift will not register as the beginning of a new pattern. It will register as a temporary exception that cannot be trusted. The relationship that appears willing to offer support will not register as a genuine resource. It will register as a setup for a later disappointment. The defeat-expecting mind is not looking for reasons to believe. It is looking for confirmation of what it already expects. The deeper tragedy of this error is that it is self-sealing. Because the expectation shapes the interpretation, and the interpretation shapes the action, and the action shapes the outcome, and the outcome confirms the expectation, the entire system feeds itself. The person experiencing this cycle is not imagining it. The outcomes they encounter are real. The disappointments are genuine, the losses are actual, but what they cannot fully see from inside the cycle is that the expectation is not just predicting the outcomes. It is participating in producing them, not through some mystical shortcut, but through the completely understandable mechanism that a character formed by defeat expectation does not bring full conviction, full availability, full perception, or full action to any situation where those things would be required to produce a different result. You were not wrong to protect yourself. Every adaptation the mind makes has a reason. The defeat expectation did not form without cause. It formed as a response to real pain, real loss, real disappointment experienced by someone who was trying sincerely and found the trying was not enough to prevent the collapse. That is a genuine wound, and the mind that forms an expectation of defeat after that kind of experience is doing something reasonable. The error is not in forming the protection. The error is in keeping it past the season when it was needed. The error is in allowing what was once a shield to become a permanent residence. The error is in mistaking the emotional shelter of low expectation for the truth about your future. Alan's teaching places the responsibility clearly, not harshly, but clearly. The thought you continue to hold is the garden you continue to tend. The expectation you refuse to examine is the seed you continue to water. The protection you maintain by expecting defeat is costing you the exact life you're asking for. This is not a criticism of the wound. It is an honest accounting of the law. And the law does not ask whether the wound was justified. It does not ask whether the history was fair. It asks what is being planted now, because what is being planted now is what will grow, and whether the planting is chosen consciously or allowed to continue by default. The law responds to the planting, not to the intention behind it. The error you did not see is this. You have been protecting yourself from disappointment more faithfully than you have been preparing yourself for increase. And in doing so, you have not avoided a painful life. You have simply ensured that the pain arrives in a familiar form rather than an unexpected one. The defeat you were bracing for has remained as a permanent interior occupant. And while you were bracing, the life that required your availability to hope, to faith, to the unexpected and the unfamiliar, was not finding the character it needed in order to take root. This is the moment of honest self-recognition that Alan's teaching requires. Not guilt, not shame, not a verdict about who you are, but a clear, sober, courageous acknowledgement of what has been happening inside, because without that acknowledgement, nothing can change. The formation continues in the same direction, and the character standing before tomorrow's opportunity is the same character that stood before every previous one. The recognition is not the punishment. The recognition is the beginning of the only kind of change that the law of thought and character can produce. The path forward begins here, not with a declaration, not with an affirmation, not with a new strategy or a better plan. It begins with the honest acknowledgement that the expectation of defeat has been operating as the inner authority, and that inner authority has been shaping the character that you bring to every situation where something greater is available. That acknowledgement is not comfortable, but it is the first moment in which the formation has a real chance to begin moving in a different direction. There is a reason this error survives as long as it does. It survives because it does not feel like an error. It feels like intelligence. It feels like the honest, earned, hard-won perspective of someone who has been through enough to know how the world actually operates. It feels like the lesson of experience, and that is exactly why it is so difficult to release. You do not easily release what you believe you paid for with suffering. The person who has lost money on a business that did not survive has paid for the knowledge that business ideas sometimes fail. The person who invested trust in a relationship that ended badly has paid for the knowledge that trust does not always lead to safety. The person who believed in a financial opportunity that collapsed has paid for the knowledge that promising circumstances do not always deliver. These are real lessons. They are not fabricated. They are not the product of an anxious mind inventing dangers. They are the summary of lived experience. And because they were paid for with genuine pain, they carry an authority that an abstract principle cannot easily challenge. This is the specific mechanism that makes defeat expectation feel like wisdom rather than error. The expectation was formed in the same fire where wisdom is normally formed. It arrived through the same path. It carries the same weight. It speaks with the same authority as genuine insight. And so when the mind considers something new, something that would require faith and openness, the voice of defeat expectation does not sound like fear. It sounds like the voice of a trusted advisor who has been through everything you have been through and who simply knows better than to be swept up in premature hope. Family patterns make this even more complex. Many people did not develop defeat expectation entirely from their own experience. They inherited it. They grew up in households where financial anxiety was the ambient atmosphere, where conversations about money were always conversations about scarcity, where ambition was met with loving caution that was indistinguishable from suppression, where the adults who were most trusted communicated through 1,000 subtle signals that hoping for too much was the path to humiliation. The expectation of defeat arrived not just through personal failure, but through proximity to the defeat expectation of the people who were most responsible for forming the initial understanding of what life is. This inheritance is particularly powerful because it arrives before personal experience has a chance to contradict it. The child who grows up in an environment of financial fear and defeat expectation does not first hope freely and then get disappointed. They inherit the caution before the attempt, and the caution carried into adult life functions as the initial assumption about what is realistic, what is possible, and what kind of life is available to someone with their particular background, their particular history, their particular family story. Defeating that assumption requires not just personal courage, but a kind of departure from an inherited identity that can feel like a betrayal of those who passed the story down. Financial uncertainty intensifies the error further. When the visible circumstances genuinely do not look good, when the income is truly insufficient, when the visible channels are truly closing and no new ones are obviously opening, the expectation of defeat receives what appears to be objective confirmation. The mind cannot easily be told that the visible circumstances are not the truth, when the visible circumstances include empty accounts and unanswered calls and an unclear path forward. The defeat-expecting mind in those moments is not being irrational. It is reading the visible reality accurately. The error is not in reading the visible reality. The error is in concluding that the visible reality is the complete reality. The fear of humiliation plays a specific role that is rarely fully examined. Humiliation is a particular kind of pain. It is not just the pain of loss. It is the pain of loss witnessed by others. It is the experience of having allowed hope to be visible, having allowed the investment in a possibility to be known, and then having that hope publicly fail. For many people, a single experience of that kind of visible witnessed failure is enough to construct a permanent interior rule. Never let your hope be visible until the outcome is confirmed. Never let anyone see the faith before the delivery. Never invest in something in a way that, if it fails, anyone will be able to see how fully you believed it would succeed. This is defeat expectation as the management of social pain, and it is as powerful as any other form. None of this is being offered as an excuse. Alan did not teach with excuses, and this teaching does not offer them. But compassion for the formation process is not the same as endorsing the formation. Understanding why the error feels like wisdom is part of what is needed to release it. Because if you approach the defeat expectation as though it is simply wrong and should be immediately abandoned, you will find that the self resists with everything it has. The self will produce the history. The self will produce the evidence. The self will produce the voice of every experience that confirmed the expectation and place them all in front of the argument for change. And the argument for change, if it has not taken the history seriously, will not survive the confrontation. The release of defeat expectation requires acknowledging that the expectation formed for real reasons, that those reasons were not foolish, that the pain behind them was genuine, and that the protection the expectation provided was, for a time, useful. It requires holding all of that truth and then asking a different question. Not, was my expectation of defeat understandable? It was. But is this expectation still serving the life I am now trying to build? Is this protection still protecting me from the right things? Or has it become the wall that keeps out not only disappointment, but also the possibility, the faith, the opening, and the provision that I have been asking for? That question is where the compassionate and honest work begins. The error does not require punishment to be released. It requires understanding. And the understanding required is not just intellectual. It is the felt recognition that the wisdom you thought you were holding is costing you something more than it is saving you. That is the moment when release becomes possible. Not because the history disappears, but because the present choice becomes clear. Understanding how the law operates is not an academic exercise. It is the difference between insight that changes nothing and understanding that changes everything. The mechanism of defeat expectation does not operate through dramatic intervention. It does not require the universe to intervene in visible ways or the circumstances to arrange themselves against you. It operates through the most ordinary and most constant thing there is: perception. The mind expecting defeat does not see the same world as the mind oriented toward faith. They are looking at identical events and reading entirely different meanings into them. Begin with a simple event: silence. A message sent, a proposal submitted, an application filed. Days pass without response. To the mind expecting defeat, this silence is not neutral. It is not simply the absence of information. It is information. It is confirmation. It is the familiar weight of rejection arriving in a slightly different form. The calculation happens instantly and below the level of conscious intention. The silence means no. The silence means they reviewed it and found it insufficient. The silence means the pattern is continuing. The defeat-expecting mind does not wait for the silence to end. It reads the silence as the message while it is still silence. To a mind not governed by defeat expectation, the identical silence may register very differently, as ordinary delay, as a response that has not yet arrived, as the normal pace of institutions, of busy people, of processes that move at their own rhythm, regardless of how much urgency is felt by the one waiting. Neither reading is a guarantee of accuracy, but only one of them keeps the door open long enough to receive what might still be coming. The defeat-expecting interpretation closes the inner door before the outer door has had a chance to open or confirm itself as closed. And once the inner door closes, the action that follows is the action of someone who has already received rejection, even if the outer world has not yet delivered one. Consider delay. A plan is set in motion. The timing that was expected does not materialize. Results that were anticipated by a certain point have not appeared. To the mind expecting defeat, delay is not neutral. Delay is early failure. Delay is the first proof that the conclusion already anticipated is arriving exactly as expected, just a little more slowly than feared. The defeat-expecting mind does not treat delay as ordinary information about timing. It treats delay as moral information about the viability of the entire venture. And once delay is experienced as moral information rather than logistical information, the response to it changes entirely. The mind that has accepted delay as early failure does not continue with the full investment of conviction. It begins the internal withdrawal. The effort continues at the surface, but the deep engagement has already begun its retreat. The mind is preparing the explanation it will offer others when the failure is complete. It is already mentally rehearsing the lesson it has learned about why this particular kind of attempt was unwise. It is already returning the inner investment to the protected interior vault, where it will be held against a future attempt that might also need to be quietly withdrawn before the disappointment becomes visible. All of this happens while the delay is still just a delay. Consider challenge. Every significant effort encounters challenge. There is no path toward anything of value that does not include at least one point where the resistance is real. The energy required exceeds what was anticipated, and the question of whether to continue becomes genuinely uncomfortable. To the mind expecting defeat, challenge is not a natural part of any meaningful undertaking. Challenge is the announcement that the conclusion is near. The arrival of difficulty confirms the expectation. The moment things become hard is the moment the defeat-expecting mind registers as the moment reality is finally being honest about the outcome that was always coming. This is not a small problem, because the response to challenge from a defeat-expecting mind is fundamentally different from the response to challenge from a faith-oriented mind. The defeat-expecting response involves a kind of despairing acceleration. If the challenge seems to confirm failure, then continuing requires explanation. It requires justification. It requires arguing against what the inner expectation is already treating as settled. The energy that should be going toward creative problem-solving within the challenge is redirected into an interior argument about whether the challenge is proof of what was feared, and that argument is exhausting, and it produces exactly the kind of depleted, half-committed continuation that is least likely to resolve the challenge. Opportunity is perhaps the most interesting case because it reveals something counterintuitive about defeat expectation. Most people assume that the defeat-expecting mind is passive, that it simply waits for bad things to confirm themselves. But the defeat-expecting mind is often quite active in its relationship to opportunity. It is actively looking for reasons why the opportunity is not what it appears. It is actively searching for the flaw, the risk, the hidden cost, the eventual disappointment that must be concealed somewhere within the apparently promising surface. This is not skepticism for the sake of clarity. This is the defeat-expecting mind, working to confirm in advance what it already expects to be the final truth about any new possibility. The result is that genuine opportunity, especially opportunity that arrives in an unexpected form, is experienced as suspicious rather than promising. The unusual channel through which provision might arrive is not registered as an open door. It is registered as an unfamiliar door, and unfamiliarity is interpreted through the lens of defeat expectation as a warning rather than an invitation. The opportunity that does not match the expected shape of delivery is dismissed before it can be genuinely examined. And this dismissal is not experienced as fear, it is experienced as discernment, which is precisely why it is so difficult to challenge from outside. Now consider what this means for the accumulation of evidence in the life of someone whose expectation is organized around defeat. Every delay becomes proof. Every challenge becomes confirmation. Every silence becomes rejection. Every unusual opportunity becomes a suspicious offering. Every genuine open door becomes, through the filter of defeat expectation, A door that either does not actually lead where it appears to lead, or will close before it can be fully entered. The life that follows from these interpretations is not a life that was condemned by external forces. It is a life that was built by the internal interpretive authority of a defeat-expecting character. Real events, interpreted consistently through the lens of defeat, produce real outcomes that confirm defeat. The law is not punishing anyone. It is reporting what the character has been training. The most painful element of this mechanism is that it operates in the very moments when the greatest inner availability would make the greatest difference. It is not in the comfortable moments that the defeat-expecting interpretation causes the most damage. It is in the moments of genuine possibility. It is when the provision is actually attempting to arrive that the defeat-expecting mind is most active in its disqualification of what is appearing. The door that was needed most is the door most quickly explained away. The opportunity that could change the pattern is the opportunity most thoroughly examined for the reasons it cannot be trusted. And so the life that is desired remains at the distance of a constant almost, perpetually, just beyond the reach of a character that has been formed to receive something quite different. There is no cruelty in this mechanism. There is only law. The mind that has been formed by defeat expectation is not being punished. It is simply operating according to its formation. The perception it produces is the natural result of the expectation it has been trained by. And the outcomes that follow from that perception are the natural result of the actions taken from within that perceptual framework. Change the formation, and the perception changes. Change the perception, and what registers as meaningful information changes. Change what registers as meaningful information, and the action that follows changes. Change the action, and the outcomes begin to change. Not by magic, not by instant reversal, but through the patient, serious, sustained work of planting a different expectation in the inner garden, and allowing the law to produce what the law always produces from consistent planting. This mechanism also explains something about why surface-level positivity does not resolve deep defeat expectation. If the perceptual system has been formed by defeat expectation, a positive affirmation applied at the surface does not reach the level at which the interpretive work is being done. The affirmation says increase. The deep formation says defeat. The affirmation is a morning declaration. The defeat expectation is an all-day operating system. The affirmation competes with the formation and loses most of the time, not because affirmation is worthless, but because it is being asked to do work it cannot do alone without the deeper inner formation work that Alan's teaching actually requires. The mind expecting defeat is not looking at a different world than the mind of faith. It is looking at the same world through a different inner architecture. And the inner architecture is the cause. It is the formation built from repeated thought that has become character, that has become the interpretive lens through which all incoming experience is processed. This is why the change required is not a change of circumstances. It is a change of character, because only a changed character can reliably bring changed perception. And only changed perception can reliably produce changed reception. And only changed reception can allow the life that is being desired to arrive in a form the self can actually recognize and keep. Faith, in the framework that James Allen's teaching inhabits, is not optimism. It is not the pleasant feeling that things will probably work out well enough. It is not a disposition toward cheerfulness or a natural tendency to look on the bright side of events. Faith, as Allen understood it, and as every serious spiritual teacher has understood it, is an inner posture of genuine alignment with the possibility of what has been asked for. It is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear become the authority that interprets incoming events and determines the character of the response. This distinction matters enormously because the failure to make it leaves many sincere people confused about why their faith does not appear to be working. They feel fear. They interpret the fear as evidence that they lack faith. The interpretation of fear as evidence of absent faith produces more anxiety. The anxiety deepens the fear, and the whole system moves further from the quiet, grounded, serious inner orientation that genuine faith actually requires. Faith is not incompatible with fear. It is incompatible with fear as the reigning interpretive authority. You can feel the fear and still choose, deliberately and repeatedly, not to allow it to write the conclusion. What does faith-shaped perception actually look like in practice? It begins with a different default interpretation of incoming events. Silence, instead of being immediately read as rejection, is held as unanswered information. Not with forced cheerfulness, not with naive certainty that the answer will be positive, but with the genuine recognition that silence has not yet spoken, and that the response of the soul before the answer arrives is not required to be dread. The faith-oriented mind does not pretend the outcome is already confirmed as positive. It simply refuses to confirm it as negative before the evidence is in. Delay, instead of being experienced as early failure, is understood as temporal information about pace, rather than moral information about viability. Things move at different rates than the mind anticipates. The provision that is coming does not always arrive on the schedule that fear would prefer. The open door does not always appear at the moment that pressure is most intense. A faith-shaped character does not interpret temporal slowness as spiritual silence. It interprets it as the ordinary rhythm of a law that moves according to its own timing, and is not subject to the anxiety-driven urgency of a mind that needs reassurance before the delivery is complete. Challenge, instead of being read as the announcement of inevitable defeat, is understood as the standard terrain of any significant undertaking. The faith-shaped mind does not pretend that challenge is easy. It does not deny that resistance is real or that difficulty is uncomfortable, but it does not allow difficulty to immediately reorganize the inner expectation from faith to defeat. It holds the challenge as information about what is required, not as evidence about what is inevitable. And in holding it that way, the energy that the defeat-expecting mind redirects into internal argument is instead available for creative problem-solving, adjustment, and the kind of sustained engagement that actually resolves challenge rather than being consumed by it. This is perhaps the most practically important aspect of faith-shaped reception. The quality of the response to difficulty is entirely different when the inner posture remains oriented toward possibility rather than collapsing into defeat expectation at the first sign of resistance. The person with faith-shaped perception who encounters an obstacle does not immediately begin assembling the explanation for why the whole endeavor has failed. They begin looking at the obstacle as something to be understood, worked around, addressed, or waited out. The obstacle is a problem to be solved, not a prophecy to be accepted, and that difference in how the obstacle is held changes everything about what happens next. Faith also changes the relationship to unusual opportunity. The faith-shaped character does not require that the open door look exactly like the door that was imagined. It is genuinely available to the possibility that provision might arrive through a channel that was not anticipated, through a form that does not match the expected shape, through a person or situation that would have been overlooked by a more rigid and fearful perceptual framework. This is what it means to hold radically open receiving. Not the passive waiting of someone who has given up on directing their own life, but the active, committed, deeply intentional openness of someone who has decided to trust the source more than they trust their own prediction about the form through which the source will deliver. The key difference between faith and defeat expectation in the moment of opportunity is not the amount of enthusiasm. It is the inner authority that is given the final word about what an opportunity means. In the defeat-expecting character, the final authority is the voice of anticipated failure. Every possibility is reviewed by that authority before it is accepted or acted upon. And the authority of defeat expectation is both quick and thorough in its dismissals. In the faith-shaped character, that final authority has been changed, not suppressed, not silenced by force, but genuinely changed through the sustained inner work of planting a different expectation. The final authority is no longer the prediction of failure. It is the serious, grounded, disciplined trust that the source has more routes available than the mind can calculate. Alan taught this without romanticizing it. He was not describing a comfortable experience. He was describing a demanding one. The person who commits to faith-shaped expectation will face the same delays, the same challenges, the same silences, and the same difficult opportunities that the defeat-expecting person faces. The law does not exempt the faithful from difficulty. What changes is not the difficulty. What changes is the inner formation that meets the difficulty. And that changed inner formation produces changed perception, changed action, and ultimately changed reception. The life that is available to faith is not a different life that arrives in a different world. It is the same potential life, meeting a different character, and finding the character finally capable of holding what had always been available. This is what Alan meant when he said that we do not attract what we want, we attract what we are. The person who has done the serious, sustained, patient inner work of building faith-shaped expectation has changed what they are. Not just what they feel on a good morning, not just what they say when the external circumstances are encouraging. They have changed the deep-formed character that meets every incoming event and decides, below the level of conscious deliberation, what that event means and what response is appropriate. That changed character is capable of receiving what the defeat-expecting character could not. Not because the world has changed, but because the receiver has. Faith does not deny difficulty. It does not promise that every attempt will succeed on the first iteration. It does not guarantee that every door will open at the exact moment it is approached. But it does something that defeat expectation cannot do. It keeps the character available to the possibility that has not yet confirmed itself, available to the provision that has not yet arrived, available to the open door that has not yet made its shape visible, available to the unexpected channel through which the invisible supply sometimes moves when the visible channels are insufficient. Defeat expectation closes down that availability in the name of protection. Faith holds it open in the name of trust. And it is only the open hand that can receive what the source has to deliver. There is one more thing that faith shapes, and it is perhaps the most foundational element of all. Faith shapes identity. The person who has genuinely moved from defeat expectation into faith-shaped expectation has not just changed a thought about the future. They have changed the kind of person they experience themselves to be. They have moved from the identity of someone to whom defeat is the natural outcome into the identity of someone who genuinely expects to receive. And that identity change is not cosmetic. It is the core of what Alan meant by thought becoming character. The character that expects to receive is a different character than the one that expects to be turned away. And it meets every opportunity, every delay, every challenge, and every open door as a different person. That difference is where the new life begins. The shift does not begin with certainty. If you wait for certainty before making the shift, you will wait indefinitely. Because the nature of the shift is that it must precede the evidence. That is not an impractical demand. It is the law itself stating the correct order of operations. The evidence follows the inner change. The inner change does not follow the evidence. If the inner formation waits for outer confirmation before it is willing to change, it has not changed at all. It has simply agreed to change under conditions that the old formation also refuses to stop trying to prevent. The shift must be made in the absence of proof that it will work, which is the only context in which genuine faith has ever meant anything. The new posture is not optimism performed for external observers. It is not the bright face worn in public, while the defeat expectation continues operating privately. It is something more serious and more demanding than performance. It is an internal decision, made with full awareness of the history, full acknowledgement of the pain, full recognition of the real obstacles, and still a clear, deliberate, disciplined choice. I will not prepare for defeat more faithfully than I prepare for increase. That sentence is not a guarantee, it is not a prediction. It is a declaration of the direction in which the formation is now going to be intentionally aimed. The beginning of the shift requires honesty about what has been happening internally, not the broad acknowledgement that life has been difficult, something more precise than that. The specific recognition of the daily moments in which defeat was the expectation the mind returned to. The specific recognition of the way that expectation shaped the interpretation of delay, silence, challenge, and unusual opportunity. The specific recognition of the moments when the inner door closed before the outer situation had confirmed that it should. That recognition, held without self-punishment, is the ground on which the new formation begins. You cannot plant a new crop without first seeing what has been growing in the garden. The shift does not mean pretending obstacles do not exist. This point cannot be stated firmly enough because the false version of this teaching, the one that dismisses it as wishful thinking, always argues that acknowledging the possibility of defeat is merely intellectual honesty. And it is true that honesty about obstacles is important. The person who denies real risks is not practicing faith. They are practicing avoidance. But the person who acknowledges the obstacle without letting the obstacle immediately reorganize the inner expectation from possibility to defeat is practicing something entirely different. They are holding the obstacle as information while refusing to allow it to become the authority that writes the final word about the outcome. The inner shift requires the active exercise of a different authority. In the defeat-expecting character, the authority that gets the final word is the voice of anticipated failure. After the shift, a different authority must be given that position, not a voice of forced positivity, not a voice of denial, but the voice of a serious, grounded, disciplined expectation of more. An expectation that says, the source has not finished with this situation. The outcome has not been confirmed. The door that I need may not be the door I am currently looking at. The provision I am asking for does not require the visible circumstances to explain themselves before it can arrive. This authority does not argue with the obstacles. It simply refuses to let the obstacles write the conclusion. Allen would call this the disciplined cultivation of the inner garden. Not the suppression of difficult thoughts, not the pretense that the fear is absent, but the consistent, patient, serious returning of the attention to the expectation of more. Every time the defeat expectation rises and offers its familiar interpretation of a delay, a silence, a challenge, the shift requires a deliberate return, not a shouted affirmation, not an emotional performance, a quiet, serious, sincere returning to the expectation that more is available, that the source is not limited to the visible channels, and that the character being formed right now is being formed to receive something different than what has been received before. The courageous element of this shift is that it must be made before the new life shows any visible signs of arriving. This is where most sincere people struggle most intensely. They make the inner shift and then look immediately at the outer world for confirmation that the shift was correct. When the outer world does not immediately confirm it, the defeat expectation returns with renewed authority. It says, "You tried the new posture and the world still responded the same way." This is further evidence that the expectation of defeat was never wrong. And without a clear understanding of why the shift must precede the evidence, this argument is very difficult to counter. The understanding required is this: the inner shift is not a single event. It is the beginning of a new direction of formation. The defeat expectation that has been built over years, shaped by multiple significant experiences, woven into the character through countless daily moments of rehearsal, does not dissolve because the direction of planting has been changed for a week, or a month, or even a year. The formation in the new direction requires the same sustained, serious, patient investment that built the defeat expectation in the first place. The shift does not produce instant results. It produces the beginning of a new formation. And the new formation, held long enough, will produce a new character. And the new character will produce a new reception. This means that courage is not required only at the dramatic moments. Courage is required in the ordinary moments, in the moment when the bill is unpaid and the defeat expectation is offering its most compelling argument. In the moment when the silence has extended beyond what was comfortable and the defeat-expecting interpretation is right there, ready and familiar. In the moment when the challenge has proven harder than anticipated and the inner voice is already composing the final summary. In those ordinary moments, the courageous thing is not a dramatic act of will. It is the quiet, deliberate, serious refusal to let defeat expectation have the final word. It is the return, again, consistently, to the expectation of more. The new posture also changes how you carry yourself before the opportunities that appear, not with performed confidence, but with the genuine inner orientation of someone who is not already internally resigned to rejection before the door is opened. The quality of the approach changes, not dramatically, not necessarily in ways that others can immediately name, but in ways that the character knows and the law registers. The expectation of receiving, held genuinely, changes what the character brings to every encounter where something is being offered or sought, and that changed quality of inner orientation changes the quality of the action, and the changed quality of the action changes the quality of the reception. The shift is not a destination, it is a new direction. The character that is formed by consistent, patient, disciplined expectation of more is not a different kind of person in any external sense. They have the same history, they carry the same wounds, they face the same real obstacles, but the inner authority has changed. The voice that gets the final word about what incoming events mean has changed. And that changed inner authority produces, over time, a changed character. And the changed character is the changed receiver. And the changed receiver is the changed life. This is the law. This is Alan's teaching. And this is why the shift, though it begins before the evidence, is the only place it can begin. The inner shift must have a daily form, not because daily rituals are more spiritually powerful than a single dramatic decision, but because the formation that must change was not built in a single day. It was built through the consistent, repeated, daily return of the mind to a particular expectation. And the new formation must be built the same way, through the consistent, repeated daily practice of returning the mind to a different authority. When the defeat expectation rises with its familiar interpretation. The practice is this. Every time the defeat expectation rises, every time the mind begins its familiar movement toward the conclusion of failure, ask a single question. What would faith expect me to do next? Not, what would absolute certainty do? Not, what would I do if I already knew the outcome was positive? Not, what would I do if the fear were completely gone? Those questions lead to paralysis because they require conditions that are not present. The question is simpler and more immediate than any of those. What would faith, not certainty, not the absence of fear, but the genuine expectation that more is available, expect of me right now? What would faith have me do with this delay? What would faith have me do with this silence? What would faith have me do with this challenge? This question does this work. It interrupts the automatic movement from incoming event to defeat conclusion. It inserts a space between the perception and the response. In that space, a different authority gets access to the situation. The defeat-expecting mind operates in the absence of that space. It moves directly from event to conclusion without examination. The question creates the examination. And in the examination, the character has the opportunity to respond from faith, rather than from the default of defeat expectation. Not always successfully, not without returning the old response on many occasions, but with increasing regularity as the new formation deepens. This practice is not an affirmation only. It is an affirmation with an action attached. The question is not, what do I feel in this moment? The question is, what would faith have me do? And the doing is the crucial element. Because Alan's teaching is not about the replacement of thought with better thought, it is about the replacement of character with better character. And character is not formed by thought alone. It is formed by thought-made action, by the inner expectation expressing itself through the quality, the direction, and the conviction of the actual outer movement. The person who asks what faith would expect them to do and then does it, even imperfectly, even with the defeat expectation still present, is actively building a new character, a character capable of a new reception. The practice also includes a commitment to the honest examination of interpretations. When a delay occurs, before accepting the defeat-expecting interpretation, pause and ask, is this delay actually failure, or is it timing? When silence occurs, before accepting the defeat-expecting interpretation, pause and ask, is this silence actually rejection, or is it an incomplete response? When an unusual opportunity appears, before accepting the defeat-expecting interpretation, pause and ask, is this suspicious or is this simply unexpected? The practice of pausing before the defeat-expecting conclusion is accepted is not a practice of naive optimism. It is a practice of fair interpretation. Defeat expectation does not practice fair interpretation. The daily practice is the conscious, deliberate choice to hold events in a fair and open examination before allowing the conclusion to be reached. There is also the matter of language. Alan was not Florence Scovel Shinn, but he understood the relationship between the thoughts spoken in the inner conversation and the character being formed. The inner conversation is where much of the daily formation happens. Every time the defeat-expecting voice narrates an event, it is doing formation work. Every time the inner conversation rehearses the final summary of another plan collapsed, another opportunity missed, another disappointment arriving on schedule, it is deepening the groove of the defeat-expecting character. The practice must include the intention to change the quality of that inner conversation, not to silence it by force, but to notice it, to hold the noticing without judgment, and then to ask the question that returns the attention to what faith would expect next. There is also the matter of what the mind is given to rehearse before sleep and upon waking. These are the moments when the subconscious is most receptive to the impressions being planted. A life being narrated at these moments through the expectation of defeat is a character being formed through the most powerful formation windows of the day. The daily practice includes the deliberate choice to return to a different inner narrative in those moments. Not a perfect positive story, not a denial of real concerns, but a genuine, chosen, sustained rehearsal of the expectation of more. The provision that is possible, the door that may open, the unexpected channel through which something needed might still arrive. Held seriously, held with genuine emotional investment, held as the final thought before the interior falls into sleep, and the first thought retrieved when it rises again. The daily practice is not dramatic. It does not require hours of meditation or an elaborate ritual. It requires one honest question asked consistently enough to begin changing the automatic response. It requires the intentional pause between event and conclusion. It requires the honest examination of interpretations. It requires the commitment to act from faith rather than from defeat expectation, even when the defeat expectation is loud and the faith is quiet. It requires the replacement, day by day and thought by thought, of the expectation that has been building the character of a person who expects defeat with the expectation that is building the character of a person who is becoming ready for more. This is not easy, but it is precisely this that Alan meant when he called it the work of the inner life. The test was always coming, not as a punishment, not as the universe examining whether the inner shift was genuine before deciding whether to allow the new life to arrive, but as the natural condition of living in a world where delay and challenge and apparent failure are part of every serious undertaking. The test does not indicate that the inner shift was wrong. The test indicates that the inner shift has arrived at the moment that most clearly demonstrates whether it is real or only surface level. Anyone can hold faith-shaped expectation when circumstances are cooperative. The test is whether the inner posture remains intact when the evidence appears to confirm what defeat expectation has always predicted. The rejection arrives, not the feared imaginary rejection that the defeat-expecting mind was rehearsing, but an actual documented, unambiguous response of no. The application was denied. The proposal was returned. The call was not the call that was hoped for. The test does not ask you to pretend that this is not painful. It is painful. Real rejection carries real weight, and the soul that was holding genuine hope for a particular outcome experiences genuine disappointment when that outcome is refused. The test is not about the absence of that pain. The test is about what happens next. What happens in the 12 hours after the no arrives? What happens in the first morning that follows? Does the rejection restore the defeat expectation as the reigning inner authority? Or does the character that has been building a new formation hold the rejection as a single data point while keeping the inner orientation aimed at more? This distinction is not small, because the moment that follows a real rejection is precisely the moment when the defeat-expecting character receives the most powerful confirmation of its formation. Everything it ever expected appears to have just been validated. The history of previous rejections aligns perfectly with the new rejection, and the argument is complete. What more evidence could be needed? The voice of defeat expectation in that moment does not sound like fear. It sounds like the sober, clear-eyed, finally vindicated voice of truth. And the character that is only beginning to build the new formation does not have the depth of new formation required to resist that voice without preparation. Preparation is what this section of the teaching provides, not the pretense that the rejection will not hurt, but the clear foreknowledge that the rejection, when it arrives, will be accompanied by the loudest and most convincing version of the defeat expectation that has been building for years, and that in that moment, the character must know in advance that one event is not the restoration of the old law. One no does not undo the direction of a new formation. One silence is not the verdict on the entire undertaking. One failed plan is not the final word on the life that is being asked for. The verdict is not in. The formation is not complete. The next door is not the only door. The source has not been fully consulted about the available routes. One event is one event, even a painful one. There is also the test of prolonged delay, not the single event of rejection, but the sustained period of time in which nothing appears to be moving, the weeks in which no answer comes, the months in which the financial circumstances remain unchanged, the season in which every direction attempted seems to produce neither failure nor progress, but simply silence and stillness. This test is often more difficult than the dramatic rejection, because the dramatic rejection at least provides something to respond to. Prolonged silence provides only the interior conversation, and in prolonged silence, the defeat-expecting character has its most favorable conditions. There is no incoming event to interpret. There is only the waiting, and the defeat-expecting mind fills waiting with the most detailed and emotionally resonant version of the anticipated final outcome that it has ever produced. The character that has made the inner shift must learn to treat prolonged silence with a different kind of inner attention. Not the frantic filling of silence with new plans, new attempts, new channels forced open out of panic rather than genuine movement, but the serious, disciplined, patient holding of the inner posture while the circumstances have not yet confirmed themselves. Alan did not teach patience as passivity. He taught it as the committed maintenance of the inner formation while the outer world moves at its own rhythm. Patience in this teaching is not resignation. It is the held expectation of more, maintained through the silence, maintained through the stillness, maintained because the law that is operating beneath the visible circumstances has not changed simply because the surface has gone quiet. The apparent failure is the third form of test and in many ways the most complex, because apparent failure is not always actual failure. There are plans that fail and paths that close that are, in retrospect, the exact redirection required for something more aligned to become available. The defeat-expecting mind cannot access this possibility in the moment. For the defeat-expecting mind, failure is failure. It is the confirmation of the feared outcome and the end of the story. The faith-shaped character can hold, even in the experience of genuine disappointment, the possibility that what appears to be the end of a particular path might be the clearing of space for a different one. This is not self-deception. This is not the positive reframing that denies the reality of what has happened. It is the serious, grounded recognition that the source is not limited to the path that was visible. It is the recognition that provision has arrived through unexpected routes before, and that the clearing of an expected route does not necessarily eliminate the provision. It may redirect it, it may slow it, it may require a different kind of openness than the one that was being brought to the original path. But the source is not limited by the failure of a particular channel, and the character formed by faith-shaped expectation can hold that truth even in the disappointment of the closed channel. The most important instruction for the moment when defeat appears confirmed is this: do not make permanent decisions from temporary evidence. The defeat-expecting mind is very comfortable making permanent inner decisions from temporary outer evidence. When the rejection arrives, the defeat-expecting mind does not just note the rejection, it updates the permanent internal record. It adds to the long and carefully maintained file of evidence that defeat is the reliable default of this particular life. And once added to that file, the evidence becomes part of the foundation of future expectation. The permanent decision to expect defeat is rebuilt from each new piece of temporary evidence. The counter to this is not the denial that the evidence is real. The counter is the discipline of holding each difficult event as temporary information rather than permanent truth. The rejection is real. It is also one event in a still unfinished story. The delay is real. It is also one period in a still ongoing process. The apparent failure is real. It is also one outcome from one path in a world that contains many paths. The defeat expectation wants to make each of these events permanent. The faith-shaped character holds them as current, as genuinely painful when they are genuinely painful, but as specifically bounded in time and scope. The story is not over. The verdict is not permanent. One event is not the law of the life. The test will come. It may have already come before you encountered this teaching. It may come again tomorrow, or next week, or in a season of difficulty that has not yet arrived. The preparation for the test is not the elimination of vulnerability to disappointment. That vulnerability is part of being alive and genuinely seeking. The preparation is the deep formation of a character that knows, in advance, what the defeat-expecting voice will say when the difficult moment arrives, and that has decided in advance not to let that voice restore its position as the inner authority that writes the final word. The test will always speak in the language of confirmation. Your preparation is to know that confirmation of defeat is a language the old formation is always ready to speak, and that hearing the language does not mean you are required to believe the verdict. There is a version of transformation that people often look for and consistently misidentify. They look for the version where fear is absent, where doubt has been silenced, where the difficult event arrives and produces no internal disruption, where the rejection does not land with any weight, and the delay does not create any pressure, and the challenge does not produce any discomfort. And when this version of transformation fails to appear, they conclude that the inner work has not produced the promised change. They conclude that they are still the same person they have always been. But this is not the sign that you have changed. The sign that you have changed is not the absence of fear. It is the absence of fear's authority over the next action. You still feel the fear. The disappointment of rejection still arrives as genuine disappointment. The weight of delay is still real weight. The challenge still creates genuine discomfort. These things have not been eliminated. They are not supposed to be eliminated. They are the honest response of a sincere soul to genuinely difficult circumstances. The transformation is not the elimination of the response. The transformation is in what the response is allowed to command. The first sign is this: the fear arrives and you feel it fully, and you do not let it write the next action. In the past, the feeling of fear was inseparable from the action of retreat. Fear arrived and the inner door closed and the effort diminished, and the interpretation moved toward defeat. Now, there is a space. A small space, sometimes, but a real one. The fear arrives, it is felt, it is acknowledged, and then a question is asked: what would faith expect me to do next? And the answer to that question, not the comfort of the feeling, but the direction of the action, is what determines what happens. That space, that small and sometimes difficult space between the fear and the action, is the sign that the character has changed. The second sign is that you catch the defeat-expecting interpretation before it becomes the conclusion. You notice the moment when the mind begins moving from incoming event toward the familiar conclusion of failure, and the noticing itself is new. In the past, the movement happened below awareness. The conclusion was already reached before the conscious mind had any awareness that the processing had occurred. Now there is observation. You see the mind beginning the familiar movement. You recognize the familiar destination. And in the recognition, there is a choice that did not exist before. The choice is not easy, and it is not always made in the direction of faith. But the choice is present, and the presence of the choice is the sign of the changed character. The third sign is that unusual opportunity no longer triggers immediate disqualification. You encounter something you did not expect, something that does not fit the anticipated shape of delivery, and instead of the immediate rush to identify its flaws, there is a pause, a genuine moment of consideration, an honest examination of what the opportunity might actually be, rather than an automatic mapping of it onto the template of suspicious offering that will eventually disappoint. This does not mean accepting every unusual opportunity without discernment. Discernment is not the same as defeat expectation. But the pause, the genuine examination, the willingness to hold an unusual door open long enough to actually see where it leads, is the sign that the formation has shifted. The fourth sign is that the inner conversation has changed in quality. Not entirely, not without the occasional return of the old narrative. But there is a different dominant tone in the running commentary the mind keeps about what is happening and what it means. The old commentary was overwhelmingly organized around the prediction of bad outcomes. The new commentary is not organized around the prediction of only good outcomes. It is more honest than that, but it is more balanced than the old formation. The possibility of good receives more than token acknowledgement before the conversation moves to the probability of failure. The open door receives more than brief notice before the attention moves to the reasons it is probably not what it appears. The balance is shifting, slowly in the way all genuine formation shifts, but the direction is clear. The fifth sign is perhaps the quietest and the most easily overlooked. It is the return. You experience a difficult event. The defeat-expecting voice arrives with its familiar interpretation. You feel the pull of the old formation. And then you return, not because the return is easy, not because the fear has disappeared, but because you have decided that fear will not have the final word about what your next action is. The return happens. You ask what faith expects. You act from that answer. Imperfectly, with the defeat expectation still audible in the background. But the return happens. And that return, made again and again in the ordinary difficult moments of an ordinary day, is the most honest and most powerful sign that the inner formation has genuinely changed direction. Alan did not promise comfort on the other side of this work. He promised alignment. He promised that the character formed by the disciplined, patient, serious planting of a different expectation would become a character capable of a different reception. He did not say the road would be easy. He said the law would be faithful. And the law's faithfulness is not to your comfort. It is to the formation. What is planted consistently will grow. What has been growing must be acknowledged and redirected. What is now being planted with genuine inner investment is already beginning to form the character that the life being desired has been waiting for. You will not feel like a completely different person, but you will act differently than you did. And in that difference, the new formation is already underway. You have arrived at the end of a teaching that has not offered comfort without correction or correction without compassion. The teaching you have received today is not the teaching of an easier life through better feelings. It is the teaching of James Allen, the man who looked at the human condition with rare precision and said, "The outer life is the report of the inner formation." And the inner formation is governed by what is planted, what is watered, and what is allowed to become the dominant character of the self. You came to this teaching carrying something real. You came with the memory of a desired life and the weight of a practiced expectation that has been working against that desire for a long time. What has been named today is the invisible conflict, the one that does not appear on any visible account, the one that does not show up in any external diagnosis. The conflict between the life the soul sincerely asks for and the character that the defeat-expecting inner formation has been quietly preparing to receive something quite different. That conflict has been named, and the naming is not a verdict about who you are. It is a clear and honest reading of what has been happening below the surface, because below the surface is where the law operates, and the law does not respond to what is visible. It responds to what is formed. You are not the expectation of defeat. You are not the accumulated weight of every time the plan collapsed, or the door closed, or the provision failed to arrive through the channel that was trusted. You are not the family pattern that handed down the language of financial fear before you had the vocabulary to question it. You are not the history that the defeat-expecting voice uses to argue its case in every moment when something new is being attempted. You are a mind, and a mind held with discipline and sustained by serious intention is capable of forming a different character. That is not wishful thinking. That is the law that Alan dedicated his life to clarifying. The choice before you now is not the choice between an easy life and a hard one. Both lives are hard. The defeated life is hard in the way of permanent resignation. The faithful life is hard in the way of genuine courage, but only one of them is moving toward the life that has been asked for. Only one of them is building the character that the invisible supply, moving through channels the defeat-expecting mind would never have approved, needs to find in place when it arrives. The choice is between continuing to plant the expectation that has been growing the life you have, and beginning today, in this moment, the serious and patient work of planting a different expectation entirely. James Allen taught that no one can receive a life that their character has not been formed to hold. The door is not kept closed by external forces alone. The door remains closed because the character standing before it is still the character built by defeat expectation. And a life that requires faith, a life that requires the radical trust of an invisible supply moving through unexpected channels, does not open for a character that is still, at its deepest level, expecting defeat. The door opens when the character changes, not before, and the character changes when the inner planting changes, not before. This is the moment of commitment, not a commitment made from emotion only, not a commitment made in the warmth of a teaching that feels true while it is being heard, but a commitment made with the full knowledge that the defeat-expecting voice will return, that it will return with the history, that it will return with the evidence, that it will return in the quiet mornings and the difficult nights and the moments when the visible circumstances are not yet cooperating with the inner shift. The commitment is made knowing all of this, and it is made anyway, because the alternative has already been lived, and the alternative has not delivered the life the soul has been asking for. You have something now that many people who carry defeat expectation do not have: a clear name for the error and a clear law for the correction. The error is the protection of defeat as wisdom. The law is that thought planted consistently becomes character, and character becomes the receiver of the corresponding life. You have the question that interrupts the automatic movement. What would faith expect me to do next? You have the understanding that the shift must precede the evidence. You have the foreknowledge of what the test will say when it arrives. You have the sign by which you will know the character is changing. These are not strategies, they are instruments of formation. The declaration that follows is not a wish. It is not the hopeful expression of a feeling that is present today and may be absent tomorrow. It is the chosen direction of a new formation. Said once, it is a beginning. Said consistently, it is a planting. Said with genuine inner investment, over time, through the difficult days as well as the encouraged ones. It is the daily work of building the character that the life you are asking for has been waiting to receive. Speak it as a commitment. Speak it as the direction you are choosing. Speak it as the honest announcement that the old formation no longer has your permission to continue growing unopposed. I no longer expect defeat. I become ready for more. If this teaching has touched something real in you, something that you have perhaps known for a long time but have not had a precise name for, then write that declaration below this video. Not as a performance, not for any external audience. Write it as the honest statement of a person who has just made a real inner decision. Write, I no longer expect defeat. I become ready for more. Let it be the first act of the new formation. Let it be the first moment in which the expectation of more receives a form outside the interior, visible, committed, and real. James Allen left behind an entire body of teaching that moves through this same law from many different directions. He wrote about the relationship between thought and purpose. He wrote about the mind as cause and the circumstance as effect. He wrote about the kind of identity required to inhabit a different life than the one that has been lived. If the teaching you received today has begun something in you, there are more teachings from the Masters waiting in this channel to meet you when you are ready. Each one moves the formation further. Each one addresses a different layer of the same invisible law. Stay with the teachings long enough to let the formation change. The law is faithful, the planting matters, and the character you are building right now, one honest thought at a time, is the receiver of the life you have been asking for.